You bought it, so stop whinging about the cost of repairs. That seems over dramatic, doesn't it? You bought it, so you stop whinging about the cost to repair it. Why am I doing this SMR? Well, it's one of those recurring things you see on various user groups, etc., etc. But there are a raft of posts, blogs, videos with people complaining about the cost of parts or labour to make repairs. And I think we need to kind of take a step back when we sort of are having these kind of conversations. And before we whinge about the cost of spares for these legacy instruments, many of which are 20 plus, 30 plus, 40. If I look at the stuff that's sitting in this cabinet here, 30 years old, not so old down the bottom there, but there's still a period of time, and technology moves on. So finding some specific spares for some of this stuff is difficult. Finding things like notes for a key bed, you've got to have the right note for the key bed, and some of these key beds are no longer manufactured, so you can't just sort of ring Yamaha up and say, can I have a note for a DX7? That's probably a bad example because I think there's lots of those floating around. They make them still because the key bed is still manufactured, but you kind of get the drift. So some parts are hard to get hold of and some parts are relatively easy, but you've got to also think about the technologies that were used back in the day to actually build these things. Many of these synthesizers weren't designed on a computer aided machine. The climate was very much different back then. We didn't have the computing horsepower that we have nowadays. I mean, your iPhone contains more computing horsepower than a PC of the 1980s, if you can find a PC of the 1980s, but that's reality. That's where technology has moved on to. So when these things were designed, they were designed by bearded guys in sandals using pens, paper and calculators, and working out values using long-winded formulas to understand what value capacitor did you need to put here, what value voltage regulator, what value resistor, how did the diodes need to be structured. And then you get to, if you were of a certain age, which was kind of the late 90s, you start moving into the kind of digital circuitry at that point. And then you had the chips that came on. But that, a lot of this stuff was done with pen and paper. It wasn't done in a computer. Computer aided design really didn't come through until the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was working in the auto industry in the late 1990s, and I had to buy 10 CAD workstations, and that cost me, or cost the company, it didn't cost me, cost the company $300,000 for 10 machines. And they weren't top of the line. I could have put additional bits and bobs on there and I could have quite easily exceeded £750,000. But for the job we needed to do, they were the machines that they needed, and they cost 300 grand. So that gives you an idea of where we are. The other thing about a lot of this legacy stuff, not so much the stuff I own, I have to be honest, but if you go back to some of the sort of really sought after equipment, much of that was conceived by said men with beards and sandals in their man caves or garages. I mean, let's face it, Apple built their first machine in, was it Steve Wozniak's garage? I could be wrong on that, but I seem to remember it was one of their garages. So the bottom line is these big corporations, from acorns, big corporations grow. And a lot of the machines that were built in those times, the instruments, they would have drawn out a set of specifications, put the thing together, thought, that doesn't quite sound right, I'll change this, or I'd change that, or I put a different IC in. They were done on the fly, and that's why sometimes the service manual does not reflect the build of the instrument itself. Maybe not optimal, but it kind of worked at the time. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. The other thing you've got to remember about this stuff is it was quite often built to a price point. It was built to, we want to sell a synthesizer for $1,500. How do we make a profit? So therefore the construction of the synthesizer itself was kind of built within the constraints of, this is our profit margin, this is how much it costs to do R&D, this is how much it costs per synthesizer. And therefore they didn't necessarily use the best components for the job. In truth, many manufacturers were not looking for these instruments to actually last more than 10 years. If truth be known, and if you think about the raison d'etre about the whole sort of music industry, the music industry is about selling you, especially in the electronica world, selling you the next whizzy thing. It's selling you all the new features of what this new thing can do and why it's so much better than the old thing you already have. They don't kind of talk about the fact it can do all the old stuff that you already have, and therefore why do you need to upgrade it? And quite often I have this conversation with friends of mine about, is Nautilus enough? And then it gets into a heated debate, and I'm not going to go into that now. But, the thing is, you've been using that instrument for 3 years, you know exactly how that instrument works, but you're falsely guided into upgrading to the next instrument. And pretty much the only thing I can say about the upgrade path is you get something that is potentially supportable. Because you don't necessarily need all the new whizzy features, but you want the new whizzy features. The short-sighted view about the life of the instrument in many instances has led to short-term decisions about the components that go into them. And I think particularly about I'm thinking particularly here about instruments made by Roland. The key bed on a lot of instruments in the sort of mid-90s era was shocking. It really was. But again, if Roland didn't expect the instrument to last more than 10 years, why would they expect the key bed to last more than 10 years? And while I've singled Roland out here, I can probably list a whole raft of other manufacturers where the same kind of decision point was made on specific components, either buttons and switches or power transformers, etc, etc. It wasn't just one manufacturer doing this. They were all up to it at that point in time. But you know what? Spares being the issue they are, that means that there are companies like Synth, many other companies exist. There's a European company and its name completely escapes me at the moment. But they have built their entire business on finding old instruments, either repairing them and selling them on if it can be done, or stripping those instruments down for spare parts and then selling them onward to the likes of you and I. Now, I use Synth occasionally. I don't use them all the time because I find the Synth made a decision because the US Postal Service was so bloody poor that they ship everything via courier now, and shipping by courier from the US, even for a small component, is prohibitively expensive. So it's only if I can't get anything anywhere else I tend to go to Synth. And even then, quite a lot of the stuff that I'm looking for at the moment is out of stock with Synth. Anyway, they've made an entire business out of this, as have another number of other companies. But you've got to kind of get to the point that things will tend to go wrong in these instruments. Typically, capacitors, they leak and they lose capacitance. Resistors normally blow. Voltage regulators are worked hard and they have to do it and eventually give up the ghost. Diodes either go short circuit or just don't work at all. And a lot of these kind of issues that you see are not one thing, but probably a number of things, like a capacitor's lost its capacitor, that's forced something to happen, that's forced a resistor to blow, that's forced So it's it's normally a cascade of things that has caused the issue. And yes, in later machines, integrated circuit chips have gone wrong. But again, chips will generally go wrong, but my experience of chips going wrong is there's normally something else that's driving it, as in there's an over voltage or an under voltage or something's not working quite right. But the short-termism that was put into a lot of the manufacturing process has meant that the original components weren't expected to last. They are more likely to go, and therefore you're going to end up with a repair bill. So here is the bottom line. If you're going to go and invest your hard-earned cash into something like this, or a legacy keyboard or a legacy drum machine, or whatever it happens to be, at some point you're going to need to go and get it fixed. You need to accept that is the case. Okay, you're going to have to go and get it fixed. And if you're going to go and get it fixed, if you can't do it yourself, you know, it's going to cost you money one way or the other. It's either going to cost it money because you can do it yourself and you can buy the spare parts, or you can't do it yourself and therefore you have to engage in a tech individual to do it for you. And one of the things I would say about tech individuals is good ones will charge you money, and do not begrudge them earning a living. Many people whinge about the fact that the service tech is going to charge them $50 an hour, and I actually think it's quite cheap. But they're going to charge you $50 an hour. But at the end of the day, they still need to earn a living, and that's how they earn a living. And you know, stripping one of these things down, you know, let's say if it's a really simple fix, might only be an hour's work. But if you've got to strip a keyboard down, I can tell you now from personal experience, that's probably at least a couple of hours work to strip the keyboard down, diagnose, find the fault, repair it, and then another couple of hours to put it back together. So that gives you an idea of what sort of cost you're talking about before you even open the lid. Owning a legacy instrument can be expensive. Be prepared for the cost. And if you have a legacy instrument that's sitting in a cupboard somewhere because it's broken and you can't or don't want to repair it, then give it to somebody who does. Give it to somebody who can repair it. Be realistic about the price. Yes, it might have cost you X amount of pounds or dollars to buy that instrument, but I can tell you now, an instrument that doesn't work is worth pretty much naff all. Okay? It's what makes the instrument valuable to somebody is the fact that they have the skills to put it back together. So, do not begrudge them for that. And I know a lot of people look at this stuff and they go, well, it cost me $500 and it's not working, but I want to try and get my $500 back. Well, guys, you'd be waiting a long time to get your $500 back. Your best bet is to knock it on for $100, enjoy the time you had with the instrument, and chalk it up to experience. And on that, I'm going to say, live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.